Lord Glenarthur, about a month before you took up your post as Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, as I think you now know, Dr. Spence Galbraith, who was a leading public health doctor, wrote to the department recommending the withdrawal of blood products imported from the United States until the risks have been clarified. And we'll just, so that everyone knows what I'm talking about, look at the document. It's it's CBLA 000043_040. I'm not going to read it aloud. The inquiry's looked at it on a number of occasions, and I know it's been provided to you, Lord Glenarthur. It's a letter from the 9th of May. If we just look at the top of the page, we can see it's from the Public Health Laboratory Service Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre.
Yes.
And it's addressed to one of the medical officials within the Department of Health, Dr. Field. It refers in the first paragraph of the letter to various reports of cases of AIDS in haemophiliacs, and then it sets out Dr. Galbraith's conclusion in the second paragraph that all blood products made from blood donated in the USA after 1978 should be withdrawn from use until the risk of AIDS transmission by these products has been clarified. And then if we just go over the page, again, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but he sets out in his paper entitled Action on AIDS his reasons for his recommendation. Now, as I understand your statement, Lord Glenarthur, this was not drawn to your attention when you took up your post just over 4 weeks or so later.
I don't believe it was. I don't recall it at all.
And there's no paper trail to suggest that it was.
No, and nor do I recall it actually being mentioned to me.
And you say in your statement that you don't recall also, unsurprisingly therefore, seeing a minute from Dr. Wolford which set out her views.
Yes.
I'm not going to put that on screen, but you've seen it for the purpose of your statement.
Yes, I have.
Does it strike you as curious that you, as the Minister with responsibility both for blood and blood products and for the Public Health Laboratory Service, of which Dr. Spence Galbraith and the CDSC was a key part, was not even informed that one of the country's leading public health doctors had written to the department arguing strongly for decisive action?
Looking at it now, it does seem strange, although I can understand Dr. Wolford's views that not to do it was the only practical way to proceed. But it wasn't brought to my attention. I do find it quite odd, looking back, that I wasn't given the stark detail that appears in Dr. Galbraith's letter.
And more generally, do you recall having much already interaction with either the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre or the Public Health Laboratory Service more generally?
Not at that stage. I believe I did visit Colindale at some point, and of course I visited CBL, the blood product BPL. But no, I don't think I had any interaction with them.
And then if we look at a second significant document, ARCH 0001710, these are the minutes of a meeting of the Subcommittee on Biological Products of the Committee on Safety of Medicines, held on the 13th of July of 1983. We looked, if we just go over the page, and I'm not proposing to go through this in terms of its detailed content, but we see halfway down the page that it says the following conclusions were reached, and there's a number of conclusions set out. I'm drawing attention to that only so that those who are following Dr. Wolford's evidence this week will note that we didn't look at this particular document with Dr. Walford, but we looked at these conclusions in a different form. And
Oh, right, okay.
But if we go back to the first page, we see the date's the 13th of July 1983. So this is, unlike at least Dr. Galbraith's letter, this is after you've taken up your post, a month after you've taken up your post. And as I understand your statement again, you were not aware that this meeting was taking place, or indeed that this decision was being taken by the Committee on the Safety of Medicines. Is that right?
I was not aware, I think at that stage I wouldn't necessarily have expected to. Looking back on it, I think it would have been very useful to have been aware of it. But so much of this stuff was being dealt with at various levels within the department by expertise, by the experts who understood it all in great detail. And looking at this list of professors and others who were involved, they were all highly qualified in their field. It's only when difficulties arose or political interests arose or a whole series of things that at that stage I would have thought they ought to be brought to ministers. But one couldn't, as a minister, get involved in every single detail on these things. Looking back on it now, I wish I'd seen these.
And I understand, of course, that there are lots of meetings that take place on a regular basis. The regional transfusion directors met regularly, the Hemophilia Centre directors met, various of the working groups and the Central Blood Laboratories Authority met on a regular basis, and not suggesting that anyone would have expected you to see every set of minutes. This was the Subcommittee on Biological Products obviously met on a regular occasion, but this was a one-off decision, one of the most significant decisions taken in 1983 regarding blood products. That's what makes it surprising, is it not, that you were blissfully unaware, even that this process was going on?
Yes, I was completely unaware.
And I detect, I think, from your statement that having now seen it, you don't think you'd have disagreed with it. But what I want to suggest to you is that that might be all the more reason for you to have seen what was being said, because if you know that the more radical step of stopping concentrates being imported is not going to be taken, because that's the view of the Committee on the Safety of Medicines, you might then have wanted to consider whether there were less radical steps that could be taken to nonetheless minimise the risk. And you weren't really put in a position, were you, to be able to do that?
No, I wasn't, and I was actually always interested in the rather technical aspects, although I'm not in any sense qualified. It was part of my interest generally in these sorts of things. So I wasn't in a position to comment. And I think another thing that surprises me in perhaps general terms, and I have made this plain in my statement, that I'm surprised that there wasn't a point at which so many of these things were coming together and coalescing in the minds of officials. They said, look, at least ministers ought to be aware of some of the competing elements and the real concerns that are being raised, even if it wasn't to make a decision, but to say you ought to be aware, O ministers, that these are perilous times in some respects, and therefore you ought to be aware of them. But that never actually happened, so far as I can recall.
So the Galbraith letter, this two examples of significant pieces of information not being shared by officials, at least with you as a minister. Do you have any thoughts or views now, looking back, on how information sharing lines of communication could have been structured differently, so that people in your position, ministers in your position, were fully aware of all options?
I suspect that whether it happened or not, I don't know, looking at those that are recorded as attending this meeting, that information should have gone up the medical chain of command to the chief medical officer. And the chief medical officer ought to have taken a view that these were matters of such seriousness that ministers ought to be involved and ask the system to arrange that that should be so. But apparently that didn't happen.
Now, can I then ask you to turn up your statement? Shemi, could we have the statement back on screen, please? I want to show you three extracts from your statement and then ask you about them. So, first of all, paragraph 25.12, page 41.
Yes.
If we look towards the bottom of the page, last 5 lines, you refer to the risk of transmission, and then you say we had to balance it against the counter risk of serious injury to haemophiliacs who would suffer from not being able to accept treatment with blood products. That counter risk is well documented and included joint damage, intracranial hemorrhage and death. So that's a short description from you about the risks of non-treatment. Can we then turn, before I ask you about it, to 2 further passages? Paragraph 29.2, bottom of page 45.
Yes.
Again, bottom of the page, Shemek, last 4 lines, you having referred to the uncertainty of or what was unknown in relation to the risks of AIDS, you say this: what was certain, however, was that haemophiliacs were in peril from unavailability of factor VIII if foreign imports were stopped. And then the last reference is paragraph 36, subparagraph 5. It's the top of page 52, Lord Glenarthur.
Yes.
You're asked, the bit in italics, whether I agreed with this policy. The policy is about not stopping importation. And you say this: I did. There seemed no practical alternative other than to suddenly imperil the lives of haemophiliac patients. It would appear your understanding was if imported concentrates didn't continue to be used as they had been, there would be serious risks to the health or life of haemophiliacs. Is that right?
That is right, because only 40 or 50% of the availability was held in this country.
When you use a phrase such as suddenly imperil the lives of haemophiliac patients, what did you actually understand the dangers to haemophiliac patients to be?
Well, I understood that bleeding intracranially and joints damage and that sort of thing were the issues that that arose. Untreated haemophiliacs also, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not a doctor, were in peril of dying if things went badly wrong. And that was what I was advised. I mean, this was not just basically my information and my knowledge. It was knowledge that I was given by the experts in that particular field.
Do you recall having any particular information, for example, about the incidence of intracranial hemorrhage, how often it occurred, or what the magnitude of the risk was thought to be?
No, I don't recall that.
Would you accept this as a general point, that in order to balance risks, and you've described that balance that had to be undertaken, you've got to understand the risks in order properly to weigh them in the balance?
Yes.
In as much as you're able to.
Yes.
You've told us how on the one side of the balance, in relation to the risk of AIDS, there was much that was uncertain. You were being advised the risk was small or very small. It would appear that on the other side of the balance, your understanding at least, was that the risks to the lives or to the health of haemophiliacs was very great indeed. Is that right? If they didn't
If
receive
they didn't
concentrates.
receive it. That was my understanding from the advice that I was given at the various briefings that came my way.
And I don't think we see language such as in peril in the contemporaneous documentation, but I may be wrong about that, but it would suggest that in your mind, at least, when you've been looking back at this for the purpose of writing your statement, you thought it was a very grave risk.
Yes, that's why I used the word.
But that's based effectively on whatever information it was you were being provided with by officials in the department.
Yes.
And you didn't have any access to any sources of information beyond that.
No, I didn't.
Could we then just turn in your statement to page 53,
Yes.
paragraph 39.2? You say in the second line, as far as I can recall, I was under the impression that cryoprecipitate was a precursor to the production of factor VIII and held other impurities.
Yes.
And then you refer to a particular minute. We may look at that when we're looking at the letter that was sent to Baroness Masham, but I'm not going to ask you to look at it for present purposes. And you go on to say there was no suggestion that cryoprecipitate could replace factor VIII for haemophiliacs. Were you aware that cryoprecipitate was still, in 1983, very much in use as a treatment for some haemophiliacs at least?
I am aware now. I'd forgotten that in the intervening period. I can't remember exactly what I was told at the time, but my understanding since is that cryoprecipitate was of use in certain circumstances, but it would have been impossible for it to have replaced the other forms of doing it. So I'm not an expert on the science of cryoprecipitate, and I remember being asked a question about it by Lady Masham in the House of Lords, and saying I didn't know what the answer was, so I come back to her and subsequently wrote to her.
Yes, and we'll look at that correspondence.
It is just worth recall that some of these things are really quite complex scientific and medical facts, which I simply don't believe I could have been expected to understand in whole anyway. Touching on them, yes, but I was relying always on advice, most of which was extremely good advice, although some bits were obviously missed out.
Do you recall what your understanding of haemophilia itself was? In the sense that there are various degrees of severity, mild, moderate, severe, and within those, a sliding scale, effectively. No single haemophiliac is identical to another haemophiliac in terms of what their needs might be or the risks to them might be. Do you remember that being explained to you at any point?
I can't recall now, but I had a general understanding that, if you didn't have factor VIII, you were not likely to allow your blood was not likely to coagulate, and hence the bleeding into the joints and into the head and things like that. But I didn't have any scientific or other briefings on it.
And it would appear from your statement, and as we've already discussed, we know that there were certain materials that didn't get to you, but it would appear from your statement that you were left with a clear impression or understanding that there was no alternative to the continuation of use of imported factor VIII concentrates. Is that right? Yes,
and that fact was made plain in the various minutes that we have looked at and seen, and recommendations from, for example, Dr. Walford, against some of the recommendations that have been made by, was it CSMB or CSM, I can't remember, but we had to continue to do that. That was a strong recommendation.
Now, explored with Dr. Wolford what various possibilities for minimising use of factor VIII concentrates, stopping home treatment not being given on a prophylactic basis, increased use of cryoprecipitate, cancelling or postponing elective surgeries,
Yes.
reserving concentrates for the life-threatening occasions or the necessary serious surgical interventions. I won't trouble you with the detail of the evidence given by Dr. Wolford, but is it right to understand that those issues were not explored with you?
No, they weren't explored at all. I imagine that these were, in a sense, clinical issues which were being discussed at a clinical level. They weren't brought to me at all.
So the picture that was painted for you, rightly or wrongly, was the stark one that you've referred to in your statement of risk of AIDS, the magnitude of which was explained to you, as against an all or nothing scenario with withdrawal factor VIII concentrates and haemophiliacs will suffer greatly. It's a crude summary. But
That is correct. The only way that I could have usefully contributed to a debate on that would have been if I had been qualified in some respect to counter it and produce different arguments. But I'm not qualified like that.
Does it concern you now that those possible alternative ways of minimising or reducing risk, not necessarily eliminating them, risks, so those less radical steps than just stopping the importation of concentrates were not drawn to your attention for you to consider?
To a certain extent, yes, but I think it would have been a matter for the options that the clinicians within and the other experts within the department were considering, and more widely, such as CSM and CSMB, to have said, look, these risks are becoming more and more apparent. And I think I mentioned it before the break, that officials might have been wiser at the time to have produced a submission for ministers setting out all these criteria and some of the risks involved. It needn't have been a reasonably summarized and condensed package of information so that ministers were aware of the facts and aware of some of the potential options, such as the ones you suggested just now. But that, as far as I know, never happened, certainly not in my time.
Now, I'm not going to go back to the original briefing document or background document you received, drafted by Dr. Wolford, other than to remind you that it referred to pool sizes. And I think probably from what you've said in your statement and your evidence, you were aware, were you, that the concentrates that were produced from the United States and imported into the United Kingdom were made from large donor pools?
Large pools, yes.
Did you know anything in particular about the actual size of the pools and the significance of different pool sizes?
I think I read in the papers of 5,000 or something was the figure of different individuals who might have been involved in it. I didn't know the scientific rationale behind all that, but broadly speaking, yes, but I don't know the exact figures.
Did you know anything, were you told anything about the practices in the United States for collecting plasma, collection from prisons? The phrase Skid Row has been used quite frequently. Possibility of collection of plasma from third world countries. Were any of those issues ever drawn to your attention that you can recall?
Not that I can recall. I don't, having looked at so many papers, I don't recall any information coming my way on that, and I don't know now whether I ever asked the question.
Can I then, as probably a last topic for today, just ask you a little about the meeting with the Hemophilia Society in 1983 that you had?
Yes.
I'll come on to the 1984 meeting tomorrow. And you deal with this in paragraphs, I think, 40, page 54 of your witness statement onwards. I don't at the moment need it on the screen, Seamus, but that's just to remind you, Lord Glenarthur. So in summary, is this right, that a meeting had been arranged between the Hemophilia Society and Geoffrey Finsberg, who had previously had John Patton's role, but had been, I think, the minister responsible for blood and blood products,
Yes.
and that had to be rescheduled due to the general election?
Correct.
And then you took over the responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
and so the suggestion, I think, was made that you would then have the meeting with the Hemophilia Society.
That's correct.
And a meeting did take place on the 8th of September 1983. If we go to DHSC 0002337_050, this is a minute from Mr. Winstanley to Mr. Joyce, so to your private office, briefing for Lord Glenarthur's meeting with the Hemophilia Society on the 8th of September 1983. The main briefing for the above meeting was sent to you under cover of my minute of the 26th of August. Pausing there, that's another of the sets of documents that hasn't been located, as I understand it.
That's correct, yes.
And then it says, Minister should be aware of the attached report of a death from AIDS of a haemophiliac. The patient had received American factor VIII in 1981, but normally received only cryoprecipitate. Although the number of deaths from AIDS recorded in the UK is now 6, this is the first instance of the death of a haemophiliac from the disease. And then there are 2 other developments you're asked to note in relation to research into AIDS.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously that's really just an update, and we don't know what the main substance of the briefing that was given to you was, because the 26th of August brief was missing. There is also, as I understand it, no record of the meeting itself. And normally, is this right, because it was a meeting involving you and officials with representatives of the Hemophilia Society, you would have expected there to be some kind of record of it?
I certainly would, and I presume there was, but it hasn't been found.
No. If we then look at the document that you wouldn't have seen at the time but have seen for the purpose of preparing your evidence, there's a briefing note internal to the Hemophilia Society at HSOC 0020347. So this is, as I say, the Hemophilia Society's own internal note, presumably of the topics or questions it wanted to raise. The first topic it refers to is self-sufficiency in factor VIII concentrates. There's a reference to Dr. Owen in 1976. There's a reference then in the next paragraph to the death of a haemophiliac. And then there is some, what's said to be a question about could the minister provide full details of predicted usage in 1985, 87 and 1990 of factor VIII concentrates. Now, I'm going to ask you a little more about self-sufficiency, about the works on BPL tomorrow. But just in relation to the Hemophilia Society meeting, can you recall the discussion about self-sufficiency in BPL at that meeting?
Not in any detail at all, no. Afraid not now.
Can you recall anything being raised about Dr. Owen?
No, I'm afraid I can't.
And then if we look at the next paragraph 2, no suspension of imported products, and then in brackets, this is shakier than when first put on the agenda. In spite of the recent death related to AIDS in a person with haemophilia, the Society would nonetheless hold firmly to their original persuasion that the availability of treatment far outweighs any conceivable AIDS risk. Yep. Can the Minister assure the Society, therefore, that there'll be no suspension of the imported product? So that's said to be the Society's perspective. And can you recall that matter being discussed? And
Yes, I most certainly can. I remember the meeting quite well. It was one of the very first meetings I had with an outside body to discuss this or any other matter, so far as I recall. And they were very persistent that they did not wish to see importation stopped.
And then the third topic there, financial support for AIDS research in the UK. Again, I don't propose to ask you about that in any detail, but do you recall that being discussed?
I don't recall it now, no.
If we then go in your witness statement to page 56, so can we put this on screen, Shomek? WIT and 52822001, page 56. Thank you.
What paragraph number?
Paragraph 41.1.
41.1, yes,
Yes,
okay.
this is a reference to evidence that the inquiry heard from David Waters of the Hemophilia Society, and his viewpoint that the Society was possibly persuaded by the facts and possibly by Lord Glenarthur and his entourage of civil servants to support the continued use of pre-March plasma. Now, the issue here, again, is one I'll ask you a little about tomorrow, the underlying issue about the dumping of products and the FDA's recommendations from March of 1983. All I want to ask you about for present purposes is your response to what Mr. Waters says there.
This is what the Society wrote, as I understand it.
It's Mr. Waters' oral evidence.
This is Mr. Waters' evidence, so you know quite why he wrote it, and that we were trying to persuade them. I mean, I think this sort of argument's turned it all on its head somehow. It was them coming to us to see that we continued to do it, to make the pre-March plasma available. So I'm not quite sure what Mr. Waters is getting at in his particular internal minute. I just don't know quite how he arrives at that conclusion. But I can't remember the detail of the conversation in any sense.
And in fairness, just to see what you say in your statement about it, top of the next page, you say in your statement, paragraph 41.2, top of the page, I cannot recall the discussion of the issue at the meeting on the 8th of September, but I'm sure the use of pre-March factors would have been raised, and I need to continue the use of existing stock. I've been asked whether I or civil servants persuaded the Hemophilia Society to support or at least not to oppose the continued use of such products. And then you refer to a letter from Mr. Waters. I'm not proposing to put it on screen. The inquiry has looked at it before, and we have it. But you've made the point that the Society's communications or documents suggest that the Society had been keen to obtain that reassurance. So, as I understand it, though you don't recall the issue being discussed in detail, your response, is this right, is you wouldn't have sought to persuade the Society of a particular position, although, as it happened, you agreed with the Society's position. Is that fair?
Yes, I don't think we tried to persuade them. They were trying to persuade us to continue to import the necessary factor. And I dare say that if officials were present at the meeting, that should I have said anything that was incorrect in what I was addressing them about, that would have been corrected by officials on essentially a technical matter.
And then just to complete the issue of your September interactions with the Hemophilia Society, you wrote to the Reverend Tanner on the 28th of September, DHSC 0002071.
Yes.
You refer to the meeting in the first paragraph. The next two paragraphs deal with the issue of self-sufficiency, which we'll look at as a topic tomorrow. And then the last paragraph on that page talks about the question of ceasing to import US concentrates, and then it refers to what's termed regulations from the Food and Drug Administration, I think probably better characterised as recommendations. And then the bottom of the page, you say the FDA has recently decided not to ban the use of similar stocks intended for the USA market because to do so would cause a crisis of supply. The same considerations apply here, and then it goes on to talk over the page about other issues. So is this correct? You set out in your letter to the Reverend Tanner what the department's position was, which was that the use of pre-March stocks would continue.
That's what the letter says, yes.
And I will, it's maybe more significant when we look at the letter to Baroness Masham tomorrow, but would it be right to understand, generally when one's looking at a letter of this kind, you haven't written the letter yourself from scratch. A draft was prepared for you by officials, which you would be at liberty to change before it went out in your name, but the detailed drafting work starts with your civil servants.
The letter starts with the civil servants. It goes through perhaps a series of different drafts before it comes to me in finished form to read through and sign, and that was quite a lengthy letter. I don't recall how I approached the draft in final form when it reached me, but I would have read it over. It didn't come with any, as far as I can recall, no letters came with a sort of backing data sheet with the reason why we've written it like this, Minister, is because. That didn't happen. One had to rely on one's memory. And of course, the volume of correspondence was huge, not just on this, but I mean, on every other aspect. There was a great deal of correspondence which had to be signed every single day by me and all my ministerial colleagues. So I'd read it through, thought it seemed a perfectly reasonable reply without pulling it to pieces. Otherwise, we'd never got the letter off stocks and sent it off. They can always revert.
And in relation to the Hemophilia Society, and I'll ask you perhaps tomorrow a little about a later meeting you had with them at the end of 1984, but do you recall having a sense of that the Hemophilia Society spoke for all people with haemophilia or particular cohorts of individuals with haemophilia? What did you know of the society and as it were, its constituency?
The society seemed to be the body that the department regarded as speaking for, I don't know whether everybody, but a large proportion of those who were involved with haemophilia. I don't know of any other organisation. It was the Hemophilia Society that loomed large in my life while I was there, and I don't recall any other organisation. So I take it that the department understood and appreciated their concern and related to them.
Lord Glenarthur, I might want to ask you a little tomorrow about the underlying issue about the pre-March plasma and post-March plasma and the extent to which you had involvement in that. But I think we can pick that up when we look at some other correspondence you had with Mr. Jenkins.
Yes, yeah.
And we'll do that, I think, tomorrow. So my next topic for Lord Glenarthur is quite a lengthy one. So rather than start it now and sit late, particularly as we had a long day yesterday, perhaps we could pick that up tomorrow morning.
Yes, well, we'll do that. So if we aim to start then at 10 o'clock tomorrow, if you please. At 10 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.